How do you get your butt bigger but not your thighs?
Don't you want to look good naked?
First things first, refer to the video that I did on the best exercises to build your glutes. That's gonna give you a lot of tips and tricks and exercises to grow your butt. So when we're trying to prioritize growing our glutes over our thighs or our quads, there are a few things that we want to think about. So the first thing is prioritizing movements that require less knee flexion, or basically just bending at your knee. So you can think of more so those hip hinge movements, so RDLs, kickbacks, 45-degree extensions. Those are going to be movements where the primary focus is going to be that hip hinge, versus movements like squats or leg press. Not saying that you can't bias your glutes or that your glutes aren't working during those movements, but they also will require knee flexion or bending at your knees, which will bring your quads into it a little bit more. Another thing to think about if you're trying to build your glutes and not your thighs or your quads is to not do movements where your stance is super wide. So having too wide of a stance can actually cause you to use more of your adductor muscles, which are more of your inner thigh muscles. So if we want to create more tension through our glutes and less through our thighs and our quads, then we want to make sure that our stance is actually more shoulder width or narrower versus too wide. And that's actually a misconception. A lot of people think that wider stance equals more glutes. That's not really the case. If we look at the anatomy of the glutes and we look at the glutes, they're around your pelvis and they use your pelvis as a leverage point. So actually too wide can disadvantage the glutes from getting their maximal output. Another thing to think about when we're trying to prioritize building our glutes over our thighs or our quads is in certain movements, specifically with your hip thrusts, when you're doing like a barbell hip thrust, for example, creating constant tension within that movement versus a dead stop is actually going to create more tension within that glute muscle versus recruiting more of your lower body muscles. So if we're looking at a thrust or a bridge variation to prioritize or to bias your glutes more, I would probably pick a constant tension hip thrust or a glute bridge over a dead stop hip thrust. And again, the reason for that is because a dead stop hip thrust or just a regular barbell hip thrust, it's really a lower body, full lower body movement, versus a glute bridge where you're just creating tension at the top of the movement. That is going to bias the glutes a little bit more and prevent you from recruiting other muscles in your lower body like your quads, hamstrings, even calves, things like that. So when we're talking about prioritizing our glutes over our quads, one of the best movements for building your glutes is a barbell hip thrust or a barbell glute bridge. But we want to make sure that we're setting it up properly to bias our glutes the most. So one of the things that I see that people make a mistake with is when they're setting up that movement, their legs, when you're in that 90-degree position, your shin should be as vertical as possible to be able to create as much tension in your glutes as possible. So think of having like a 90-degree angle that is created from your ankle to your knee and then knee to the hip. So think shins vertical, versus if your feet were a little bit further out and your shins weren't as vertical, that would be recruiting a little bit more hamstrings because your legs are actually straightening a little bit. So it's biasing a little bit more hamstrings. Or if you were bringing your feet in a little bit, that's actually going to recruit a little bit more quads. And the reason for that is if you think about it, your knee is going to be bent a little bit more. Think about your calf coming towards your hamstring. If you're closing that gap between your calf and your hamstring, that's what we call knee flexion, right? And when you're flexing your knee, it's recruiting more of your quads. So again, if we're thinking about this hip thrust movement or this glute bridge movement, the more you can have your shins vertical to the ground, the more you're going to be able to create as much tension as possible in your glutes versus your quads or maybe your hamstring. Another thing to think about when you're performing the barbell hip thrust is the tension that you're creating throughout the full range of motion, right? So if you are doing a barbell hip thrust where you are losing tension at the bottom, so you're literally letting the weight stop at the bottom, which we call a dead stop, and then coming back up, and you're doing that every single rep, that's what we call a dead stop hip thrust, and you're actually going to be recruiting a lot more of your lower body muscles doing that dead stop. Versus if you were going to do a constant tension hip thrust or a glute bridge where you're really focused on that top portion of the movement, right? So a glute bridge is really focused on the top portion of that hip thrust movement. You're not coming all the way down to the bottom. So you're keeping tension throughout. That's going to allow you to keep a lot more tension within your glutes versus recruiting some of the other muscles that go along with that movement in general, which would be those quads, thighs, adductors, which are their inner thigh muscles, hamstrings, things like that. So if we're looking at other movements such as the squat or leg press or even step ups, if we're looking to prioritize our glutes over our quads, we want to make those movements more hip dominant versus knee dominant. And all of that means when you hear someone say hip dominant or knee dominant, it just means that with hip dominant, we're looking to close the gap between our thigh and our stomach. So we're bringing, if you think about bringing your knee up to your stomach, that's closing the gap between your thigh and your stomach, versus knee dominant is you're closing the gap between your calf and your hamstring. So if you look at a squat from the side angle, for example, if you want to make that more of a hip dominant squat, you're going to think about, okay, how can I get as much hip flexion as possible? That is going to be more of a hip dominant squat, focused more on coming to around that 90-degree angle when you're coming down, keeping your shins vertical. That's going to bias more of your glute muscles, which we're talking about that right now, trying to bias the glutes over the quads. If you were to do a quad dominant squat, you would actually think about pushing your knees forward and trying to close the gap between your calves and your hamstrings. So that would be more of a knee dominant squat. So that just gives you an idea of like what, when people say hip dominant or knee dominant, it's just looking at what's happening at the hip and what's happening at the knee. Another thing to think about too is for step ups, for example, if you're doing a step up, I love cable step ups. Those are a great form of step ups, especially if you can hold on to something to add some stability. With that movement, when you're trying to make it a glute bias step up, you're actually going to want to lean forward a little bit to create a little bit of a stretch in your glutes. And then also make sure that you're keeping that shin vertical as you're stepping up, because that's gonna make sure that you're not getting as much bend at your knee. So overall, if you want to prioritize building your glutes over your quads, you wanna focus on movements that require less knee flexion or less bending at the knee. So those are gonna be your hip hinge movements. You wanna make sure that when you're performing hip thrusts, like barbell hip thrusts, that you're focusing on proper alignment with your feet. So vertical shin, feet not too close or too far out, having that kind of 90-degree angle. You also want to focus on keeping constant tension, especially at the top portion of that thrusting or bridging movement. So adding in like the glute bridge and just focusing on that top range of motion versus coming all the way down. And then for movements such as squats or step ups, making sure that you are prioritizing, again, more of that hip dominant focus so that you are, creating that vertical shin, maybe leaning forward a little bit in the cable step up and focusing on, again, closing that gap between your thigh and your stomach for more hip flexion, focusing on that versus closing the gap between your hamstring and your calf, which is more knee flexion. So those are just a few tips to focus on to prioritize glutes over quads.
Women, we believe